Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. As I normally do, I want to take us through a bit of information just to frame our conversations and let you know what you have to look forward to. So the first thing is I'm super excited to share that a few weeks back, we had Reverend Neil Thomas as our special guest for the vodcast, and there was a medical emergency that caused him to have to cancel that date, or rather, I guess I should say postpone, because we are bringing him back. He is joining on next Friday, April 30th. And my colleague, Natasha Poritskova, is actually going to be leading that conversation, but it's all about diversity and inclusivity, specifically throughout the LGBTQ community. So we hope that you will register and join us for that conversation next Friday. And then following that, I'm super excited because one of our relatively new colleagues at NWC, Christina Gartner, has been, well, actually a whole month today. She's a DEI manager with NWC, and she's going to be leading and facilitating and hosting the vodcast that's going to take place on the first Friday in May. That's May 7th. And we're super excited to have Starlet for and she's going to be sharing her story about being a woman of color and first-generation college student while leading tips on how to begin making a difference. She's doing some great work in this space of DEI, helping those who want to pursue a career in DEI. So we look forward to hearing from her. And I am super thrilled that my colleague, Christina, is going to be leading that conversation. Okay, next slide, please. This is the moment that I always get really giddy about because we spend a lot of time thinking about who would make for a great co-host that will yield really good conversations. And so we are always super excited when people accept our invite. We don't take that lightly. And so today is no different. I'm so excited to welcome Bernadette Smith of the Equality Institute. I'm going to give her a formal introduction. And then as we normally do, we're going to allow her just to greet this audience in her own way, sharing some things that perhaps we wouldn't be able to know about her just from reading her bio. So Bernadette Smith is the CEO of Equality Institute and is an award-winning author of 3 books. Bernadette has presented to enthusiastic audiences of CEOs, associations, entrepreneurs, leadership teams, sales professionals, account executives, marketing executives, human resource managers, and more. Her expertise has been sought after by the New York Times, Forbes, The Washington Post, and Fast Company, among many others. And she's appeared on The Today Show, the BBC, National Public Radio, and CNN. And today she's appearing on NWC. You'll see how I put that together. I know, not a comparison, but anyway, we like to think so. Bernadette's practical, witty, and thought-provoking presentation will put your members at ease while helping them to understand the value of diversity and inclusion, promote diverse teams, and build a culture of inclusion. In 2018 and 2019, Bernadette was named one of Chicago's notable LGBTQ executives by Crain's Chicago Business and one of the top 25 women in meetings by Meetings and Conventions magazine. I'm so excited to welcome Bernadette to the vodcast today, Intentional Inclusionist Vodcast. And I ask that our guest today, please allow her to feel welcome just by your words that you can place into the chat so that she knows that we are just really excited to hear from her. Bernadette, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone, wherever you are in the world. It is great to see you out there and know that you're out there anyway. I can't quite see you, but it's great to be a part of this community and a part of this conversation. And thank you for the incredibly warm welcome, Nika. I'm excited about this.
Absolutely. So, okay, as I promised the audience, now you have to tell us a little bit more about you, things that maybe we would not know by, again, just hearing some of the elements that found its way into your bio. What is your story? What is your journey? And how do you like to show up to this work?
So my story is that back in 2004, I was living in Boston, and there was an announcement that the state of Massachusetts Supreme Court was going to rule about whether same-sex marriage was going to be legal. So I raced down to the state house steps and was there, and they made an announcement that same-sex marriage was going to be legalized in Massachusetts, the first state in the country. Then they were trying to change the Constitution and all this stuff. But I decided right there and then that I was going to start a business specializing in planning same-sex weddings for LGBTQ couples. And so I decided to be an activist wedding planner so they could navigate a very traditional industry There was only about a third of Americans that supported same-sex marriage at the time. And I knew these couples could be facing real discrimination.
Yeah.
So I started the business and I got a lot of press. So that's some of the press mentions that you referenced there. And I ended up writing 3 books over the course of that part of my career, all about LGBTQ weddings. My 4th book is coming out later this year. There's nothing to do with weddings. Anyway, at some point I realized and I had moved to New York City. At some point I realized I got into this to be an activist, but here I am all of a sudden planning these $250,000 weddings. And it's not really who I am. It's not part of my identity. And I don't feel like an activist anymore. So even though I had also evolved my business into training wedding and hospitality professionals and hotels and caterers around the world, I was also really feeling like I hadn't been fulfilling my activist side. So I retired as a wedding planner, and I now do DEI full time, and I focus on really creating safe spaces, because that's what I was doing as a wedding planner, was creating safe spaces. Yeah. And one of my former clients was a transgender woman, and she hired me. She was like 50 years old, getting married to a woman. And she asked me to help her be the bride she'd always dreamed of. And, it's like, that's meaningful stuff. And, she was scared. She was scared about how her experience would be trying on dresses. She was scared about discrimination and rejection. And I felt like I could take care of her. And that's the type of approach that I bring into my work with clients now. Even though I'm a retired wedding planner, it's still all about creating those safe spaces for everyone to be authentically themselves in a very caring way.
I love that. So yeah, the activism is definitely coming out, and what you're sharing with us today. And I'm seeing a lot of allyship there as well. Representation certainly matters. And so if without this conversation, if I were just read, okay, wedding planner, now DEI practitioner, I probably would have questioned how the two connects, but the way in which you've told that story, it is phenomenal. And so, wow, you said 3 books all on LGBTQ wedding planning, and you have a 4th one that you're working on right now. How far are you into the process of the 4th book? Are you at liberty to give us a high level at all, so we can kind of tease it out?
Yeah, it's at the copy editor, so it's getting close. It'll be out this fall. The book is called Inclusive 360: Proven Solutions for an Equitable Organization. The subtitle might get some nuance there, but some tweaking. But essentially, it's a guide for DEI councils and organizations really starting their diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. And it's really focused on positive stories. It's a super solutions-oriented book for folks who are ready to roll up their sleeves and get to work, and they're just looking for ideas. And so these ideas all come from brands that are doing things like pay equity, or they're doing things like expanding their supplier diversity programs, or changing the way they hire. And so all of these stories come from stories I've been collecting over the past few years and putting in my weekly newsletter, 5 Things. And so this book is really about inclusive, certainly in hiring, but also in product design, also in marketing, also in how leaders interact with their team. But it's also about how employees interact with their customers. So it truly is 360. It's about solutions for every part of the organization.
And the title again is Inclusion 360.
Inclusive 360.
Inclusive 360. We're going to put that into the chat so that we can make sure that people have that top of mind and be on the lookout for it for when they can place their orders. And I heard you say fall of this year, so that's really exciting. Congratulations to you. Book number 4. That is awesome. So let's talk about
I was just going to say, it feels like a major breakthrough to write a book that has nothing to do with weddings.
Well, that's great. We're super
excited.
Like
I've really turned a page.
No, that's good. Sounds like it's going to be a very good tool, good practical resource and tool for people. So I want to make sure we do a little bit of level setting around Equality Institute. So you're the CEO.
Sure.
Tell us about Equality Institute, and tell us about Equality
Sure.
Institute.
So I own a diversity, equity, and inclusion firm, and we focus on helping meeting organizations where they're at in their journey. So personally, I do speaking and writing, and that's sort of and visioning. But I have folks on my bench that do things like, diversity audits and inclusion audits and strategic planning, coaching for leaders, coaching for underrepresented employees, lots of workshops. I personally teach a couple of LGBTQ workshops, and then our allyship and inclusive leadership workshop and keynote. So, and I have other folks who teach on cultural competency and anti-racism and other stuff. So it's we offer a lot of solutions, and we're fun to work with.
That is great. So I have to ask, because there's so much conversation these days on the equity piece, right? And you have very deliberately titled your firm Equality Institute. How do you reconcile the equity piece, knowing that it is interconnected, obviously, to equality, but is vastly different? Just talk to me about that.
Sure. Well, I think equality is the highest aspiration.
Yes.
And we don't get there without equity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Perfectly stated. I know. If equality is the hope for, end, then the means to get there is equity. I love that.
Yep.
Very well stated. Okay, so now let's talk about unconscious bias, also known as implicit bias. I often share that at NWC, we like to put a positive spin on it. So we talk about it as conscious inclusion. But you talk about how it needs to be rebranded. So share with us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, similar to you, putting a positive spin on things, or at least a less negative spin on things, right. I think is really helpful, because a lot of folks, they attend an unconscious bias training, and the main takeaway they leave with is, all right, everyone has bias. Now what? Right. And it's not so solutions oriented. The way I like to approach the topic of unconscious bias is that we all make assumptions. And when I'm delivering a keynote, or when I'm talking in a workshop, I talk about the assumptions that I've made. And some of them are silly. Sometimes, I talk about a time I assumed someone was pregnant and she wasn't. And boy, was that mortifying for both of us. Right. And other assumptions that people have made about me, about my relationship, about my role as a parent. And some assumptions are, we just get over them. We move on. But some assumptions can actually cause real harm. And those are the assumptions that can cause big problems, certainly in customer service, but also in how we interact with our team. And so my overall message about this is we can, instead of making assumptions, we should ask better questions.
Yes, I love that.
Or we should ask questions in general, because usually we don't. And then I provide folks with a tool called the ARC method, our ARC, Ask, Respect, Connect. And that's a framework to ask better questions.
I love that. So let's delve into that, because I am a firm believer too that a questioning frame of mind is really powerful. And like you, we spend a lot of time making definitive statements, but not enough time asking really thoughtful questions. So talk about your ARC method.
Yeah, so the ARC method is a tool that I provide, and it's really used in 3 different contexts. One is to help organizations make great decisions by really getting to the root of the problem. Second would be on a one-on-one with a team member or a coworker or a client or whomever. And the third would be to speak up as an ally if you witness a microaggression or you witness something that could be potentially, harassment. So there's 3 contexts. And really, it starts about coming from a place of curiosity, not confrontation, and being willing to ask the deep questions.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I prompt companies to ask is, what can we do to make this a great place to work for Black transgender women with a disability?
Yeah, all of those intersections, right? Yes.
Right? Because if you can make
Yeah.
your organization a great place to work for someone like that, then it's going to be a great place for everyone. And that
Yeah.
concept, by the way, comes from the book Unleashed, which is about the question they prompt companies is, what can we do to make this a great place to work for Black working moms? Let's take it a
Yeah.
step further than that.
Love that.
But then you also have to, that's a type of question, but then you have to actually respect the answers. Don't dismiss them. Even if you don't like what they tell you, respect
Right.
that this is a process, and a process that's going to lead to real change. And that's the R. And then the C is to connect to solutions. It's about actually following through, committing to the promise, connecting to systemic change or policy change, at least in this one context of the arc. So there's like 3 different models that I share with folks.
I love it. And my team is on it. They're placing all of these tools and this information into the chat. But yeah, I agree with you. We make a lot of assumptions. So part of us mitigating unconscious bias, implicit bias, is our ability to unlearn misinformation that we have stored up about people, whether it's generalizations, stereotypes, and it comes from so many different places. It could be maybe we were personally, the victim of some of those microaggressions, micro inequities, or perhaps the media, or perhaps, is picked up from what we've experienced or seen throughout organizations that we've been a part of. So yes, we have to unlearn the misinformation that we have about people, which, to use your word, yes, oftentimes those are just assumptions. So
exactly. Assumptions are a shortcut.
yeah, I love that. Assumptions are a shortcut. Yes, do the hard work. It's like you said, follow that authentic curiosity to ask the questions to learn more so that those assumptions won't just stick, right? I love that. So let's talk about how this relates to customer service. That's what I'm really interested in too.
Yeah, well, this kind of goes back to my early career, because back then the assumption was, and even now, the assumption was, if, you get a call from a woman getting married, she's marrying a man, so yes. You get questions like, what's the name of the groom? And all of the forms are brides' names and groom's names. So all of the marketing is totally gendered. All of the traditions are totally gendered. And all of that is unconscious bias.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? It's exclusion. It's unintentional exclusion.
Yeah.
But you have to change the systems, you have to change the policies and change the scripts to be intentionally inclusive, right?
Mm-hmm. And Bernadette, when you think about some of the clients that you work with when you were doing the wedding planning, just talk about maybe the stark difference in the experience for the individuals that were able to feel completely whole and accepted, just because those small considerations that had big impact. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the main thing to be aware of is that same-sex couples have to come out every single time they reach out to someone they're considering hiring. Every single time they have to say those words. We're a same-sex couple. Are you okay with that? Or some version of that. Or my fiance, and you have to like gender it somehow to sort of send the signal, and that's vulnerable. And and there's this fear of rejection every single time, over and over and over again. What the opposite of that is organizations that send a signal through their marketing that they're inclusive, that their policies and forms are all gender neutral and inclusive, that there are no gendered questions that customer service folks or sales folks are asking. Not what's the name of the bride and what's the name of the groom, or no mention of the bridal party or the best man and the maid, the assumption that there is a best man and a maid of honor. So going the experience of a couple who doesn't have to constantly correct is incredibly freeing. But that's my past. And so that's how I learned these concepts. But they really apply to all aspects of customer service. I mean, when I was talking to, doing a lot of hotel training for hotels, I say, all right, let's ditch the gendered greetings. Get rid of sir and ma'am, because you can't assume gender just based on someone's appearance or their voice.
Right, absolutely. You said something so profound to me. I actually just wrote it down, but having to constantly not having to constantly correct is so freeing. And we could apply that. I mean, certainly you were talking about it in the context of the LGBTQ plus community, but we can apply that across so many different marginalized communities. Having to correct at every turn to explain yourself, that is exhausting. And it leads to
Right.
fatigue. It leads to feelings of oppression. I mean, yeah. That statement is so powerful. Not having to constantly correct is freeing. Yes, indeed, it is. So you've gifted us with that. I appreciate it.
The emotional labor of correcting
Yeah,
assumptions. Yeah,
right.
it is a
Yeah.
burden.
Yeah, it's so triggering too. It just reminds me, I just released a new blog article that talks about that, how people are easily triggered for a multitude of reasons that we don't even pay attention to, especially if part of our sources of power or privilege, we're invisible to them because that's not our lived experience. So we don't even know the harm that sometimes we are placing on people. And that's why it's so important for these conversations is to make us more open, to allow us to understand what is inclusive language and how can we then incorporate that into our leadership journey and how we show up and interact with others. What are some other assumptions you see?
I mean, the huge public assumptions related to customer service were the Starbucks incident in Philadelphia,
Yes.
where two Black men were arrested for trespassing while they were after one of them wanted to use the restroom while they were waiting for their friend to arrive and the meeting to start. And that was a pretty big deal on the customer service side. Also, there have been incidents on airlines where young Black women were assumed that they were not doctors when there was a medical emergency on board and were not allowed to help sick passengers. Those types of things were also very public. So I think, and there definitely have been public assumptions related to use of restrooms. Changing rooms. I think at Urban Outfitters, there was a trans person who wanted to use the changing room and the employee assumed the gender, and, like that type of stuff happens a lot as well. But it happens they happen all the time. And really the problem that I think is that we get so stuck in our heads. Yes, the assumptions are shortcuts, but even when we want to do the right thing, I think that so many of us overthink and we're so afraid of saying the wrong thing that we say nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely hear that from people who I've talked to about LGBTQ plus stuff. They're like, I'm afraid of what do those letters even mean? There's more of them every day. I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. And so they say nothing. Same thing with race. People are totally afraid of saying the wrong thing on race. White people, I was for a very long time. And so we don't speak up as an ally because we're afraid that we're going to say it wrong.
Yeah. Fear diminishes candor. Fear also keeps people from being called to action. And all of that is damaging. We often say at NWC, we have to encourage people to choose courage over comfort because you will make a mistake. It's not, if, it's you will make a mistake, and that's okay. Apologize, correct yourself, and move on. But don't be afraid to step out of that bubble because that's where the learning and the growth occurs, is when you're outside of your comfort zone. So I appreciate you amplifying that for us today. So what is your advice to organizations that are really trying to make sure their customer service process, even just the experience, the workplace experience is vetted to a point where people have conducted an assessment or an audit to understand where there could be gaps that's creating bias that continues to perpetuate harm? What advice do you give to organizations?
Well, I want to start with the systemic solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can we actually specifically change policies to be more inclusive, whether they're hiring policies, recruitment policies, promotion policies, benefits? So let's change the systems. And at the same time, let's also focus on behavior change, because if you focus just on training and just on, behavior change or unconscious bias training or allyship training, but you don't change the systems, then we sort of default to human nature and human error. But the policy changes, the systemic changes are permanent, hopefully. That's the goal, right? They are, if we change the systems to be more equitable, then we reduce the risk of human error.
Mm-hmm. I
They
love
have
that.
to go hand in hand.
Yes, they do, both. That is great, and that's actually the approach that I think leads to sustainability. Because you're right, that's where we're also putting some accountability behind it, is when we build it into the protocol, the practices, the systems that you mentioned. Otherwise, we are relying too much on people to always have humanity, at the core, respect at the core, and everyone is at a different place in their journey. And sometimes we don't know what we don't know. It doesn't excuse us from our actions, but it makes it hard for us to hold people accountable if we aren't building systems around the behaviors that we want, and the outcomes that we want. It's a better word, the outcome that we want.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so that's really what I try to encourage my clients to do, is to not just, do a check the box training. Yes, we can do that. But if you want this to stick, then let's dig deeper. And I'm going to push you on that. And that's actually the whole focus of my book. The book Inclusive 360 is all about policy change. There is a section on behavior change and, training stuff, but it's mostly policies. It's mostly best practice policies from organizations around the world who are willing to step out and change the systems to be more equitable, to be more inclusive. Yeah. And what does that actually look like in reality?
Yeah, dig deeper. That's what I heard you say, Bernadette. Dig deeper.
That's right.
I want to just remind our audience that we will be shifting a little bit to take your questions. So definitely make sure you're dropping those into the chat. My team are actually curating all those questions, so they'll bring them into the backstage chat, so we'll have easy access to them. But I want to go to another question now. Your approach to DEI is from a strength-based approach. You really believe in the positive lens. And I like that, because there's so much complexity around this work of DEI that it tends to cause people to already enter into the conversation with some level of anxiety. So I think that any positivity that we can surround the dialogue with is positive. So you talk about celebrating the small wins. Can you share where and how you celebrate these small wins? Are there some examples that stand out to you?
Oh, that's a great question. I celebrate the small wins every week in my newsletter when I share 5 positive things. And then we go live on LinkedIn on Monday afternoons, and we debrief the 5 things in 15 minutes. And it's all positive. It's all good news. So I like to shout out those companies on the regular, because they're inspirational. And even organizations that are smaller with, hundreds of employees can still be inspired and adapt and tweak these policy changes taken by big organizations. Because there are, even if it's just changing a little bit about how you spend your supplier diversity dollars, or where your company does your banking, like those are the types of things that can be small wins and like the low-hanging fruit. But there's momentum behind them.
Absolutely.
Right? Absolutely. You have to start somewhere. And getting some wins is really what's going to get traction, and also prove to your employees and your customers that you're serious about this stuff.
Right. Yes. Small, quick wins. Sometimes it's referred to as, what's the low-hanging fruit opportunities we can gravitate to that'll give us traction for some bigger, more loftier goals. And so I definitely like that approach. People want to see movement. And so having some quick wins is really important while you're still working out, building that solid foundation for some, bigger change to come. So I really do appreciate that. Is there a brand that stands out to you as doing this work well?
Well, there are some brands that I really respect their policies in general. I mean, I think Target does so many things well. And I mean, this is not a small win, but as a huge win, it's one of my favorite examples, is that their Black Employee Resource Group a few years ago curated a collection of Black products by Black business owners that are showcased and spotlighted on Black History Month. That collection keeps expanding. More money is being put by Target into incubating these businesses to do even better and giving them the resources and support to scale. And I just think that that's really an equitable solution. And they're a big company and they're spending tens of millions of dollars on this, but they're really addressing root cause issues on both the product side, the internal side. I mean, they're empowering their employees in a huge way.
Yeah, no, Target is doing some really great things. And what I love about the story that you've shared, I remember reading about that, is even with their ERGs, their business resource groups, employee resource groups, they are empowering those individuals to not only have this space of solidarity where they're connecting and they feel safe, but equally important, they're giving them projects and assignments and helping them to lead to outcomes that are business, has a business imperative for the organization. I think sometimes that's missed. We have to make sure that we are aligning the two together. ERGs are most successful when it's not just about, special cultural events that the group can plan, but it's also about how do we connect them to some business mission critical work. So I love that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And by the way, pay your ERG leaders.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Pay your ERG leaders. I even like to suggest, we suggest this all the time in NWC because we do a lot of work with organizations helping them to form their DEI councils. Pay the folks who are serving in that capacity. Make sure that they have time to create and to do whatever the work requires by serving in that capacity, because otherwise it's going to fall by the wayside, because you're always going to have competing priorities when you think about your main job responsibility and these other, what's perceived sometimes as extracurricular. So building the infrastructure to allow people to be successful is so important. So I'm a big fan of that too. Yes. Yeah. Compensate your leaders, your ERG leaders. Well, we have some questions that have come in from our chat. And so this first one comes from Mark. And the question is, while marriage equality is now the law of the nation, and so many LGBTQ plus organizations and leaders never shifted their focus beyond marriage, how do we expand on equality for all LGBTQ folks?
Well, that is a big question. And the simplest answer would be if the damn Senate would pass the Equality Act. That would make things a lot easier for LGBTQ plus Americans. For those of you out there who don't know, in about 28 states, it is still legal to refuse someone access to housing or public accommodation simply because they are LGBTQ or assumed to be LGBTQ. There are no federal protections. And as of about a year ago, there were also no federal protections in employment discrimination. The Supreme Court has now made it illegal to discriminate in employment. But anyway, these are really big fears that a lot of LGBTQ folks have. They could be, completely dismissed or rejected and have no recourse, especially if there are no protections in individual cities or towns. Anyway, the solution is for the Equality Act to be passed. It's been passed by the House. In Congress, the president has indicated he would sign it, but it has stalled in the Senate. So that would be the best solution. But really, I believe that a lot of organizations fill the gap between what is protected by law and what is needed by LGBTQ plus employees.
Right.
So there are a lot of organizations who are sort of bridging that gap by providing additional protections, by certainly having inclusive HR policies and equal benefits for LGBTQ plus and non-LGBTQ plus employees. And I think there's a really important role to play there. And also when the lines are blurry between life and work, especially in this remote environment, I also think there's a role for organizations to play in hosting conversations about inclusion. About LGBTQ plus inclusion and allyship, and everyone else inclusion and allyship as well.
No, I love it. Great response there. Okay, this next question comes from Ashton. In your 5 Things series, what are some of the most encouraging, actionable strategies that organizations are leveraging to support systems change?
Great question. These are all great questions. It's really one of the things that I'm seeing a lot more of recently is supplier diversity and incubator programs for BIPOC businesses. And that is something that is really significant because it is an equity issue. It's not merely diversity. Not that, I'm not trying to diminish. It's not merely inclusion, but it's really equity. It's about changing the systems, increasing access to shelf space, increasing access to spending, increasing access to sponsorship and leadership. And all of that is really, really significant. And so, yes, organizations like Target, but also organizations like, United Airlines just created a policy to train more BIPOC and women pilots with significant scholarship dollars behind it. Bank of America is doing a lot as well. So that's the type of stuff that really excites me because the numbers of money that's being committed is awesome. I mean, we're talking about I think Bank of America, $500 million, like a lot of money.
No, there was $1 billion. I remember when they first made their announcement, it was $1 billion. Yes. And just incredible. So what a way to lead. And I'm hoping that the vulnerable, disproportionate communities are really going to be able to take advantage of that. You've mentioned supplier diversity a couple of times in this conversation, and that's something that I'm really connected to as well, especially as a Black female founder of an organization. Some of the work that we do with our clients is helping to manage direct programs that are centered around giving minority businesses an opportunity to grow, to scale to size, to build capacity, to understand how to compete effectively in the marketplace, connecting them with key procurement leaders of organizations and government entities so that they are in the consideration set. And so it requires intentionality. That just does not happen, right? And so I love the fact that you've amplified supplier diversity a couple times in the conversation too. It's really critical.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, and I want to say that, I mentioned some really big companies, but any size company can start to do this. Any size company can start to look at who are you spending your money with? Yeah. And how can you just shift it, shift it by a third to different businesses that might be able to, where you're able to spread the spend. It doesn't have to be at this massive level. It can start small and get those easy wins, get that traction, build that trust. I mean, I will tell you that, Nika, a year ago, I was in the market I wanted to hire a new business manager, a virtual assistant. And I had to look really hard to find a woman of color to interview. And I know that sounds really strange, but I was getting referrals from folks. I was looking for VAs online, and I specifically wanted to make sure I had a diverse set of candidates. And I literally went to LinkedIn and I typed in virtual assistant in LinkedIn, and then I invited people to apply. It does require intention.
Absolutely. 100%.
Even at the level of a small business like mine, you can do it. Right. I ended up hiring someone who's amazing. She happens to be Black, but I hired her because she brings 20 years of experience in corporate America. And I don't have that experience. And I want someone with that experience on my team. But I had to have the intention to consider how I was spending my money, who I wanted to consider. And it doesn't happen by accident, just because of the way our brains are wired for comfort, safety, assumptions.
Yeah, we're conditioned to do things how we've always done them. And so at the heart of this work in terms of, again, sustainability and impactful outcome is one's ability to be intentional. We have to create these opportunities to be able to, generate greater equity. So I love the example that you gave. Okay, so this next question is from Lauren. What are best practices for creating truly safe spaces, particularly in the invite, facilitation, engagement within these spaces? How do we create
Well,
truly safe spaces? Yeah.
it starts with leaders. It starts with leaders who understand the principles of psychological safety, who understand the importance of making sure that every employee voice matters, that it's also starts with policies that give employees permission to be authentically themselves. So policies that allow folks to have full expression of who they are. That's why I love the Crown Act, because there's, being passed in states across the country. The Crown Act prevents natural hair discrimination. And it's something I've never even had to consider. But it happens, right? It actually is a real thing. And so anyway, I think that policies that promote inclusion are important so that employees can start to feel like they can be themselves. But then it really does come from leadership, knowing how to create psychologically safe spaces that give employees permission to not only be authentic and share their big game-changing ideas, but also to speak up if they witness something potentially offensive. I mean, it sort of goes both ways, but a lot of it comes down to leadership.
Yeah, leadership and policy. I love that, for creating safe spaces. So Bernadette, I know that you offer anti-racist training. Can you give us a little bit of an idea as to how you facilitate that training? What's kind of your philosophy and your approach to it? Specifically, the question is, there's an array of views in your audience. And so how do you frame training in a way that meets everyone where they are at, while covering very hard truths about racism and how it exists within our systems?
So my philosophy on anti-racism training is that it should be focused on, again, systems change. And because racism is a system. And I co-facilitate this with someone on my team, a woman of color on my team. And she brings a multicultural background to this conversation. But what I believe about this is that, again, racism is a system. And in order to be anti-racist, we have to change the systems. And so this training is presented in kind of a fact-based way. Like, here are examples of systems of racism in the United States. Some of them, like redlining, prevented folks from having access to be able to buy housing and generational wealth as a result. Some of them are systems which have held people back from leadership roles in organizations. Some of them are systems that have to do with, mass incarceration. Like, so here are examples of systems. Fact. We're not going to debate this.
Right.
Why does this happen? White supremacy. Okay, you can say, oh, I'm not racist. Fine, but you've benefited from white supremacy.
Right.
And so I talk about my own perspective of having benefited from white supremacy. The time I was pulled over when I was 18 and my car reeked of weed and I didn't get arrested. I didn't even get a ticket. I got off. Would that have happened if I was Black? Probably not, right? And so I use myself as an example of how I have benefited from white supremacy. And then we just talk about solutions. Again, and what are the solutions that you can do as an individual or as an organization to be anti-racist? It's about changing the systems. It's about changing how you're spending your money, changing the podcasts and the media you consume, amplifying voices of people who are different from you, not centering yourself, and so these are, and supplier diversity, so these are ways, but it's very practical at the end of the day, because I want people to feel like they have a solution.
Yeah. I so appreciate that approach. And I'm also grateful that part of you telling your story of your approach to anti-racist training is amplifying that you don't go in and do this alone. You have a colleague, a person of color you mentioned. And that was, I'm sure, very deliberate to the conversation, because I think that is important. There's a lens from that lived experience perspective that is hard to connect with others if that's not there, if that's missing. So I appreciate the acknowledgement of that. I also appreciate the acknowledgement that, the vulnerability of being able to stay. I benefit from white privilege. I benefit from white supremacy. And to let that also capture the minds of those who are sitting back and saying, well, there's no such thing as white privilege. That's not really real, And I think that we need more people that are non-Black, non-people of color, that are extending that message to the audiences that they have influence with. And so anyway, just wanted to acknowledge that and say thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so that sort of goes to the question, that the deeper question of which I think was asked was, how do you meet the audience where they're at? I talk about my own journey because I'm not perfect. I've been on my own journey, for a long time. I stuck with the gay thing. Anytime someone would say to me, you want to go to a Black Lives Matter rally or a fundraiser for this inner city school, I'd be like, I have my thing. I do the gay thing. Yeah. I stayed in that lane. And so it's my own, so I tell stories like that because you can evolve. We can all evolve.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I mean, that's why I share my own experience in my presentations, because I think people can relate.
Yeah. Now, Bernadette, do you ever have audiences, or maybe just individually, people will approach you one-on-one and say that maybe their perception is you aren't being your allegiance to the LGBTQ plight and the LGBTQ needs are being diminished because of also serving in this role where you're giving credence to the other issues of oppression that are occurring with other marginalized communities? Is that ever a conversation that you find yourself in? Because I will say that as a Black female and as a DEI practitioner, I get asked often about, well, yes, I understand what's happening with the racial injustices, but what about the LGBTQ community? What about the people with disabilities community? Almost as though it's a zero-sum game, And I just find that interesting. I wanted to get you just to react to that.
First of all, I am sorry that people challenge you in that way. That's got to be really hard.
Thank you.
I don't get that.
Yeah.
I don't.
Good for you.
I don't know why. I don't. I mean, I'm empathetic to everyone's plight. Most of us got something going on, whatever it happens to be, whether it's financial issues or family drama or whatever. I mean, most of us have something going on. And I think that, yes, diversity can mean a lot of things. And yes, white privilege still trumps a lot of other types of oppression. But there's room for all of us, I think, to feel included.
Absolutely. Okay, this next question is from Christina, and her question is, you mentioned earlier feeling as though you were detached from your identity as an activist while doing wedding planning. What are your feelings regarding contributing to inclusion and representation, or even activism through entrepreneurship, and how do you rectify being a business person and an advocate at the same time? It's a good question too.
Oh, yeah. It's a great question. And I used to work for nonprofits. I'm an AmeriCorps alum. I worked, my entire probably first 5 or 6 years of my career before I started my own business as a nonprofit. I worked in the nonprofit sector. And so what I decided at the age of 27 was that I would much rather be a capitalist and give it all away. Volunteer as much as I can, be on boards. I decided that early because I did not enjoy the experience of, I did not have positive experiences in the nonprofit industry by and large. And so I knew that that's not how I wanted to spend my career. But I also knew that I could be a social entrepreneur and do an awful lot of good. And so right now, I'm in a sweet spot. I feel great. I love what I do. I love that I get to have conversations like this. I feel like I'm making a significant difference. I feel fully, authentically expressed. And I feel like I've been waiting for this my entire career, because in the wedding industry, I was covering. I didn't feel like I was authentically myself.
Yeah.
And so I feel great now. I I'm happy to donate money. I'm happy to have people on my team who are, earning money, and it's great.
I love your response to that. I am right there with you. I am unapologetically a capitalist. I also happen to be in a space where I do work that's really meaningful, and it's okay for the two to exist together, right?
Exactly.
Are you a B Corp by chance? Is your company a B Corp?
I'm not certified yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm probably going to do it. I just haven't done it yet. Yeah.
Well, maybe we can do it together. We're actually in the process of researching that as well. But yeah, and I think that sometimes when you're in this space, it's easy to feel as though, gosh, maybe we shouldn't be charging for this, or maybe we shouldn't be charging this price point. This is work that's all about humanity, and I just have a different perspective on it. My husband and I have a foundation, so we have our platform for being able to exercise, philanthropy to the things that we care about. But this is a business. It just happens to be. I happen to be very gifted and fortunate to be in a space where what helps to provide income for families and my family is also meaningful, and I think that's a beautiful blend.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I am with you 100% on that.
Those companies are going to pay someone. Might be us.
Right. And you know what? I appreciate that this whole discipline is gaining greater credence that I think at one point in time it did not have. And I'm a little protective of the discipline in that regard, because I want to see it maintain that momentum. And if we don't assign a value to it, then I think it's going to diminish the value in people's minds of the work. And so, yeah, there's a couple different reasons that my mindset around this is where it is. But yeah, you definitely, what you shared resonates with me so deeply. So I appreciate you bringing that to the fore and allowing me to kind of latch onto it.
Of course. It sounds like we're totally on the same page on a lot of things.
Yeah. Great. So what is your outlook on DEI training and consulting? Do you think 10 years from now, the demand will be as high? What do you think what kind of shifts are we going to see maybe in the next 10 years?
What we're going to see in the next 10 years is that, yes, it's going to be higher, because it's not just going to be on the HR side. Yeah. On the internal side, it's also going to be more about customer facing and the customer experience. And the frontline employees are going to start to get more training, and we have to figure out creative ways to reach them. The folks in plants and on the shop floor are going to get more training, and we're going to have to figure out ways to reach them. And so what I think the future is a more holistic DEI experience, not just sort of it feels a little shallow right now on the training side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so much under the broad umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I don't think that we've really fully scratched the surface yet, to be honest with you. I mean, every day the world is evolving and changing, and even when I think about the intersectionality, there's so many different intersecting identities that when combined in so many different ways, creates opportunities for us to become even smarter about how in which we create spaces of belonging. And so, yeah, I look forward to see the shift as we continue to increase in multiculturalism. We're seeing that with the younger generations. And so I think it's going to require us to become even smarter about how in which we approach this work. You know, it's just like other industries. There are lots of trends and best practices, and we need to bring a level of ingenuity and innovation to solving for DEI. And that's what's exciting for me, is to see that play out and to find its way into practitioners' work, into organizations, and align that with the impact. That's really beautiful for me. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm super interested in the technology side of it too. Like,
yes.
You know, I don't know if have you seen any demos of unconscious bias training through VR? Like, that stuff is wild.
Yeah, I have not, but yeah, I'm intrigued by it as well. And you know, I think that as a discipline, as an industry in a space, we probably need to be thinking a little bit faster pace about how do we really incorporate again some of that technology that allows us to be even smarter about what we're doing. So maybe Bernadette, the call to action for you and I is to talk offline about how can we bring this to fruition for our industry that we love, right?
Yeah, exactly.
How
Exactly. I
can
would
we
love
do
to.
that? Okay. So anyway, there's lots of good chatter that's going on into the chat room. People are really appreciative of all that you've shared. You're getting some thank yous. But I want to give you the last few moments to share anything that we've not talked about today that you have some passion and energy around that you want this audience to know. And that's how we're going to end.
Sure. I just put a cheat sheet to the ARC method in the chat if you want to
Oh, great.
download that as conversation starters. Again, because I think that a lot of folks, they get stuck on, I don't know what to say, so I'm not going to say anything. And so the ARC
Yes.
method is the conversation starters for that. Really, you know, what I want to kind of take away is that we all have a role to play.
Mm-hmm.
And chances are that you and I, people out there, probably have it better than a lot of others, lots of different kinds of others, and we all have a role to play in lifting people up. And
Absolutely.
I think it's like the universal law, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to give.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the way of the universe. And so if we want to have an abundant life, I think we just have to give. And even when it feels like there's stuff dragging us down, I think we just have to find a way to keep giving and sharing and leading with love. I know that's kind of cheesy, but
No, no, not cheesy at all. It's actually beautiful. And what a great way to end today's podcast. Yeah. Thank you so much, Bernadette. We appreciate, we know that you could have spent this time doing so many other things, but we're so glad that you accepted our invite. I always say that when people say yes to us, it makes us feel seen, valued, and heard. And I think that's such an important gift. And so we don't take it for granted. I also want to thank members of this community that have connected today. I hope that if you've heard something that really has resonated with you, that you won't just keep it to yourself, but perhaps you'll also bring someone else into the conversation so they can have the benefit of it as well. As we always do, we will send out this afternoon a follow-up email that will have a link to the recording. Do a watch party, invite your friends, and have some dialogue about what we heard today from our special guest, Bernadette Smith. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Again, Natasha Portskova will be leading that conversation. And we hope that you all have a fantastic weekend. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank
you,
you,
Bernadette.
everybody. Great questions. Take care.
Bye-bye.